Alright, this month we're going to be painting hibiscus flowers. They're highly requested, and I thought they would be perfect for summertime. So I'm going to start by doing a forward-facing hibiscus flower. And they've got these really full, lush petals. So I'm going to try and represent that. Again, when we're painting loose, we're not really going for photorealism. We're just trying to capture the feel and the movement of the flower. So that's what I'm really going for here. So when they're forward facing, all of the petals are going to be pretty equal in size. I'm going to paint 5 petals. Alright, and then while that's still wet, I'm just going to tap in a little bit of color right to the center here. You can see some parts of my painting have already dried, but that's okay. And then while this is drying, I'm going to move on to our 3/4 side-facing hibiscus flower. I keep wanting to say hydrangea. It's hibiscus or hibiscus. I think it depends on where you're from. I've heard it both ways. So for this one, I'm mixing in a little bit of Bordeaux, which is kind of a magenta color, with the same quinacridone rose that I was using. So with this one, I'm going to start with the petal that's closest to me as the viewer. And then I'm going to paint the side petals. So these all look really similar in size and shape to the bottom of this flower. The main difference is how we're going to paint the top 2 petals. So here, instead of painting them equally spaced apart, I'm going to kind of split them in half. So one is going to be coming more this way, and then the other one is going to come this way. And you still want them to feel like they're belonging to the same flower. But the reason why we do this, I'm actually going to bring this petal up just a hair, is so the stamen can come up in between those 2 petals, and it feels like it's a little bit more side-facing. And now to do a total side-facing flower, we're going to do one down here while this is drying. And I'm actually thinking I'm going to paint this one yellow. So I'm going to start by painting the 2 front petals. So these kind of come up, they start in the middle, they come up a little bit, arch outward, and then the paper that I'm using doesn't dry very even when I use a lot of water. This is, what paper is this? Oh, this is fluid watercolor paper. It's a nice inexpensive option, but It's not my favorite for when I'm using a lot of water because I kind of get these little splotchy parts in my flower and the blends and the bleeds don't dry very evenly, but that's okay. Still works. So I'm going to let this dry actually, and then I'm going to come back and finish that one off. Okay, now this is dry. So I'm going to go in and add a third petal. While this is wet, I'm just going to go in with a deeper pink or red or orange. I think I'm going to do a little bit of a mixture here. A little bit of orange and pink mixed together. And then just tap in a little bit of that color down here. I'm being careful not to fuss with this color too much. I'm just wanting to let it do its thing. So while this is drying, I'm going to go in and finish off the other two flowers that I've done. Now here is kind of a choose your own adventure kind of way to finish this off. If you have access to gouache or acrylic paint, then you can use an opaque paint to fill in the stamen. And I know not everybody has access to acrylic or gouache paint, so I'm going to show you how it will look if you use that, but then I want you to know that you can also use just a darker color, like I could use a dark pink or a dark red that will still show up on here. You do not have to use the light gouache or acrylic. So this is acrylic paint, and I'm just going to put a little bit on my paper towel because I don't want to put it on my watercolor palette. I've got a little bit of white there, and the lid is not cooperating with me. There we go. And then a little bit of yellow, and I just want a touch, not a lot there. And I'm going to use a smaller paintbrush. Now, gouache would actually be ideal here because it's basically like watercolor paint, except for it's opaque, so it gives the same kind of feel as an acrylic paint, but it acts more like a watercolor paint. So here I'm going to paint this in, and I just want to make sure that that is really opaque so that you cannot see through it. Actually might add in a little bit more yellow. And then add in those little dots at the end. Now again, you would follow the exact same pattern that I've used here, but instead of using acrylic, you could use a dark red or a dark pink, something that's going to show up on top of the color you've already put down. Just want to make sure I rinse out my brush really, really well. And then when I'm finished painting, I'm going to wash this with a little bit of soap and water just to make sure I've got all of the acrylic paint out. So if you leave that acrylic paint in there, it will ruin your brush. Now I'm going to use the darker paint method over here. So I've got alizarin crimson, and I'm just going to come straight up from the center here and add in those dots. And this one is still drying, so I'm going to leave that alone for just a moment. But over here, I am wishing that I had a little bit more detail. That's just a personal preference though. You definitely do not need to add the details if you don't want to, but I'm just going to add a few little paint strokes here just to help define that center. I'm going to do the same thing up here. Even though I have that paint that kind of I tapped into the center, I just want a couple more little defining lines. When I talk about not fussing with the paint, that is what I'm talking about. I just messed with this and it just kind of messed that up, but that's okay. Still works. Okay, now as soon as this top part dries, I can add the stamen on here, but I'm going to show you how I'm going to finish off the bottom half of this flower, because if you were seeing the side like that, you would also be seeing the green part underneath. And so I'm going to add that in right now. It's funny how some of these flowers don't look like much of anything, and then once you add the details, it really helps everything come to life. Alright, I've allowed this flower to dry completely, and now I'm going in with that dark color again. And then instead of having the same color for the little dots, I'm going to change it up a little bit and do some yellow. Alright, so there you have 3 different ways to paint hibiscus flowers. Obviously you can change this up a little bit if you wanted to go with a more white looking hibiscus flower. You would just, here, let me show you how I would approach that. So I've got my light pink here, or whatever color you choose to use. I'm just mixing in a lot of water. And then once I've got my pink and my water mixture, I'm just going to paint a smaller version of this. And then while the flower is still wet, while the paint is still wet, I'm going to go back in and just tap in a little bit of color there in the center. And then once that is dry, I can add my stamen in the center. If you wanted a little more definition around the edges, you could do just like touch a tiny bit of color just along the edges. And be careful that your paint is still wet. Otherwise you won't get a nice bleed. Like over here you can see it's not quite, it's a little bit too dry right there. Alright, and then once your flower is dry, you can go in and add that dark center. I just like a little extra definition to help me really define what type of flower it is. So I'm just going to take a really light color here, kind of help define these petals. And that's how I would approach painting a lighter hibiscus flower.